Good morning. I am Ignacio Trigueros. I am professor at ITAM. And it is my responsibility to moderate this table. On the perspective of OECD and CEPAL, with comments to the methodology and implication on results. We have André Hoffman, PhD in economy from Nottingham University in Holland, working since 1986 in CEPAL, first in CEPAL UNUDI on technology, and now in the Department of Economics of Economic Forecast, director of the CEPAL publication, expert deputy at United Nations for Industrial Development from the Nottingham University in Holland. He has worked in several countries in Latin America, main interest areas in economics, comparative economic growth, accumulation of production factors, services, and historic capitals in Latin America. With a comparison, has published 2 books and around 40 articles. I think that I would give the floor to André to hear his comments. Just recall him that he has 30 minutes. Good morning to you all. It is a great pleasure to be once again here in Mexico, and I thank you. I thank the invitation of INEGI and ITAM to be attending to this session on the presentation of a very important report on total productivity of factors and its links to growth.
They've asked me to say something on productivity and growth, and in Mexico and the LA clumps. LA stands for Latin America. So I am going to, in my presentation, see what has been touched. Many of these topics have been discussed already, so I'm going to focus on other issues that haven't been mentioned yet. So let me try and okay, so the first part is what happens with the LA CLEMS project and what are its future perspectives. Second, I will try to explain in further detail the difference between the old and the new methodology. Although this is a subject that has been discussed already, it continues to be important. And I'd like to present some of the results, some of the comparative results between Mexico and other countries in Latin America. Okay, so EU CLEMS have been mentioned. However, it's important to mention that it's not a statistical project, and it's not only a university analysis project. It was born from a concern from the Lisbon Summit of the European Union. There, it was noted that the growth of Europe was clearly inferior to that of North America, and nobody knew why. We had the impression that this could be related to information and communication technology. So the CLEMS project has, aside from the normal structure, it has incorporated measurements for what we call TICs, which would be investment in TICs mostly, which would be communication and information technologies in Spanish. So what kind of information do we obtain from TIC? It's a new platform from CLEMS. It's a new way to understand this, and it's not only a series of variables that we could look at horizontally. This project goes into detail. It goes into 30 capital sectors, and this series of information was unthinkable 5 years ago. And I think the first or second person who spoke of Schumpeter. And one of the things we have available, which is this neoclassical tool, and other people speak of evolutionary economics and the difference between both. Effectively, well, this project is able to bring together analysis between two types of analysis. And it's also important to mention for the evaluation of national policy. In the case of Mexico, I've seen that many people say that this type of information is very useful for this evaluation. We've also highlighted the importance of this project because it makes international comparisons. You can compare Latin America with developed nations as well as with India, China, and other Asian nations who are beginning to, and well, I'll mention this in the next slide, but Asian countries are not too far from CLEMS, and there's not a single developed country that's as advanced as Mexico. Mexico is an example when it comes to CLEMS implementation. So we have it here. We started with 4 countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. Well, Chile is because it's close and there's plenty of information available. So Mexico, I think we need to underscore the participation of Mexico in the project. So if you present this, it's almost scary. These are capital series for 30 sectors of the economy, disaggregated 7 types of capital formation. So I thank you for having accepted this project 4 years ago, and I'm extremely happy with the results that we are celebrating today. It's important to mention that Mexico is disseminating this information in a very specific way through seminars, through interaction with users, and in this sense, I think Mexico is an example. And we'd like to thank Mexico and congratulate it for this. So let's go a bit faster now because this has been said, but in Latin America, we have 6 countries. Aside from the 4 I've already mentioned, we have Colombia and Costa Rica. Colombia has its database nearly ready, and Costa Rica is undertaking this work. So we will have an important number of countries in Latin America who will have this tool available. So it's important to underscore the fact that in Latin America, this information is compiled by the national statistic units. I don't know if you're familiar with the EU CLEMS database. There's no more than 5 or 6 countries in which we have full work in terms of national accounts. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I see that Paul is writing a few things down, so maybe there are a few more countries. And there are countries in which research institutes have been doing this work. In Latin America, it's almost without exception national statistic units. So this gives a different light to the project. So working with series, we want to create a series of consistent data, and they are perhaps less focused on analysis. I think somebody mentioned at the beginning as well the characteristics of this database and what it means for the INEGI. The INEGI realizes that they are entering the analytical field. So it has this data has special characteristics, but there is a huge richness in terms of this statistic institute not only creates data but generates statistics and interprets the data in a way. Another important thing to mention is that they're not all of them are great students. In the project, we're happy if we achieve a 9-sector deaggregation for application, because for many countries it's more difficult to accomplish this, to accomplish a greater level of disaggregation. And the components have been discussed in more detail. These points are being mentioned by several. Let me just see if there's anything special here. Well, yes, something special worth mentioning is, I don't know if this is your case, but just when I was listening to Dale Jorgensen, who is almost 80 years old and who is very lucid, he mentioned very little on the sectorial part. He mentioned the aggregates and the sectorial, yes, the 30 or so sectors are important, but yes, what's also important is that this type of work has a long history, and he mentioned Dennison, and that's important. Yes, you have Jorgensen working, but Dennison, his empirical work is very important and is worth mentioning as well. So there are points that I think we mentioned. World clumps. Okay, this is also, I think it was clearly mentioned by Dale Jorgensen. However, for Latin America, we are beginning to work with 4 more countries: the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and I forgot, Bolivia and Ecuador. They are also interested. So this would generate a 10-country database which would give us huge coverage in terms of production and population. So we have many countries working together. The last point, the EVA in Spain. We showed the book. The EBO is a Valencian Institute for Economic Research and has worked closely with Latin American countries. These new ways of understanding the accounting of growth is not something that can only be done for one of these 3 countries. In Chile, for instance, the discussion on the potential product And economic policy is closely related to these subjects. And there is a series of experts who receive data with capital, and they do their calculations, and they do this in a traditional sense. This can generate important differences. So it's important to make a difference between capital services and labor services. The work factor can generate huge differences. In Mexico, for instance, blue is the total productivity of factors in Mexico, with the capital stock and hours, with both quantities of these. And if it includes quality of hours, and that's quite surprising because of the presentation we saw by Francisco Guillen. The total productivity of factors drops greatly, and if we add capital factors, it doesn't have such a huge effect on this. So here we can see the movement or the flow of capital services and traditional capital, and you can see that they are quite similar and they are complementary in a way. And this is something that this result has identified as well. Employment services are, well, we have the difference between quality and quantity, which is quite important. Composition is also a term we use for quality. In Mexico, we are working on the total productivity of factors, but in reality what we are doing is generate a database, and within this database the issue of productivity of work is very important. So we have this slide here where we can see that the productivity of work is grows far from the PTF. It's worth explaining, but it's somewhat of a surprising result. Now the comparison between the four countries. Okay, I think somebody in the last session mentioned the issue of indexes. These are also indexes made with the CLEMS methodology, because we don't have level comparisons, because they require, of course, the PBs per sector, which is something different, which we're discussing with Groningen University, but it hasn't been solved yet. But here we can see tendencies. First, for the work productivity capital, which is similar in Brazil, in Mexico, and in Chile. It grows relatively fast. It grows fastest in Chile, and the results, there's an error here. In Argentina, the red, is productivity of capital, which grows in every country, except in the case of Argentina, where there's always we always have data problems, not only when it comes to crisis, but data in general is very hard to interpret. But the results for the PTF in the case of Mexico is not as surprising, especially in a country with such growth as Chile, who is a model country for most. The PTF is also negative. Periods here are somewhat different. Sometimes we don't have data, updated data for 2011. This would change this this slide a bit, but it's notable that every country has a negative growth in the PTF. An element worth mentioning is that, this is not very slightly, but you can see investment in informatic equipment. So this would include computers, software. It was all estimated here, and we compared it to other countries as a percentage of the GDP. And you can see that Brazil has a high importance. It's at the same level as the United States in terms of percentage of the GDP. The other countries are at a lower level. So this shows that there's a difference when it comes to incorporating these ICTs in growth. So there would be a difference in terms of modernizing the economy. And this would, of course, be debatable, but taking this into account, we can begin to say, okay, what do ICTs have to do with growth? And what sectors of the economy that grow highly produce the ICTs and which ones consume them? So this would be our question for Europe and North America, not that much for Latin America. Here we are consumers. We import most of our ICTs. Here we have growth of the aggregate value between 4 countries and the components of this growth. Our first column is added value. The third and fourth have to do with labor, and there is a certain homogeneity between the countries. So there's an effect of the capital factor, but if we pay attention to the capital factor, we can see a difference that's notable between the countries. Brazil's investment in ICTs is higher than its investment in traditional capital, although it's relatively low. In Chile, the growth is based on traditional capital services. In Mexico, it's the same case, although the rate is somewhat higher. And in Argentina, traditional capital formation is negative. So this makes the analysis somewhat complicated. Every country except Argentina has a negative productivity of factors, but this gives an idea of the composition results. Okay, greater quality in the labor. Chile and Mexico, a normal pattern in productivity increases, positive contributions of IL in the quality of the labor. Argentina, as I mentioned, and Brazil, improvements only in the quality of the labor. So we can see these common results and heterogeneous results as well. So what are the factors for growth in Mexico? Well, Francisco has presented on this subject already, so there's no importance to go into this, and I'm going just to pass through this relatively quickly. Here is growth per sector. You may look for this presentation down the road if you're interested. I think it will be published or uploaded. Okay, contribution of industries. What industries contribute greatest to productivity of work, it would be transportation and communications industry. This, in the country, you need to analyze the whys. Here we have the productivity index, and I think we can't really see this very well, but we have results per sector, per 9 sectors. And you can see in the first ones, in the first 3 sectors, agro, mining and industry, that work plays a small role and capital is very high. All negative, however. In every sector, this is negative. So in the last line, you can see that in these 3 sectors, capital is more important. And it gives us the impression or the idea that the intensity of capital is higher than in non-commerciable than in the ones that are commerciable. We have the results for Brazil here, and there are at least a couple of positive sectors, agriculture and transportation, but the tendency is relatively clear of what is happening. In Brazil, the work factor is more important, so it's an issue of capital investment. Finally, a few of the things that have been mentioned as extensions of this type of work. This structural change in Latin America compared to other countries or not. Mexico for 91-2009 gives account of a small structural change, and this is it shows how we pass from a less productive sector to a more productive sector, and this creates greater productivity. If people leave a sector, this sector could increase or decrease its productivity. This is a static effect, and the other effect is the movement between what we would call dynamic sectors. So for the period going from, well, there's a small effect of growth in structural change. Chile, in the last part, but you can tell that there's hardly any structural change. In Brazil, structural change is more important than the net effect, and Argentina is always difficult to quantify. So, just to finish, these are the 4 elements that we want to underscore. Research, consistent, uniform methodology. It complies with all the requirements of international organizations, and it gives account of sources of growth. Thank you very much. Thank you, André. I'd just like to mention that I'm very surprised that the only country in which the total of factors grow is Argentina. And my question is, what are the implications on the formulation of policy? Well, I'm very happy here to present Paul Schreyer, who works in the National Accounts Division. He's the chief of this at the OECD. And his areas of research include challenging subjects such as measuring capital and productivity, and the measurement of productivity in complicated areas such as health and education. He has a great number of publications in the OECD on information technology, communication, other subjects. He was also a speaker at the Stiglitz and Fitousci Commission for the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. He's been working at the OECD since 1988, and he's also an intern for research at the Munich Economics Center, and he taught economics at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. So without further ado, Paul.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure being here, even though my stay will be very short. I have to go back tonight, but it is certainly worth the effort to listen to these exciting events here. What I'd like to do in the next 15, 20 minutes or so are two things. First, I'd like to place some of the results into an international context and link things a little bit back to GDP and GDP per capita, and actually some of the remarks today already pointed in that direction. And secondly, I'll try and make some remarks on the figures released by INEGI and maybe throw out one or two ideas about future developments that may have an impact also on some of the results. So let me start out by something that is very simple and that we always look at when we're looking at productivity. We say, well, there are two things that drive GDP per capita. One is labor productivity, so that is GDP per hour worked, and the other thing is what we call labor utilization, that is labor per inhabitant. Okay. And the graph that you see here shows basically the two components and how they contribute to the growth of GDP per capita. And you see that in many countries, labor productivity, so GDP per hour, is an important factor, an important driver of GDP per capita in the population, and that includes the figure for Mexico, which is somewhere in the middle here, if you see it. So that is the starting point. But of course, the immediate next question is, well, okay, we have the growth rate of GDP per hour worked. So where does this labor productivity growth come from? One avenue that is pursued when we try to explain the growth of labor productivity among countries is the so-called catch-up effect. There's kind of a general hypothesis that countries who exhibit a gap in their level of GDP per hour with regard to the average OECD can catch up quicker because they can import technologies and learn quicker. And the graph shows this a little bit. What you see in the blue diamonds is the distance in the level of labor productivity of the different countries to the OECD average in 1995, so a few years ago. And the bars show you the productivity growth of the countries relative to the OECD average. And on the whole, you see what you would expect. Those countries who are on the left side, that is, who have a big gap in 95, their productivity growth is relatively fast compared to the average. And on the right-hand side, you have the opposite, that is, those countries who exhibit a high level of GDP per capita tend to be less rapid in their productivity growth. That holds, but actually if you look at Mexico, you see that Mexico has a small negative relative productivity growth, so it actually didn't catch up. And anyway, here we're looking at labor productivity. We haven't talked about multi-factor productivity at all. So that only shows that there is an issue of productivity that certainly needs following up. And as I said, that is the starting point, is macroeconomic labor productivity, but we'd like to know what drives this and where does it come from, and this is really where the INEGI work kicks in. So what you do is you want to decompose in a first approximation this growth of GDP per hour worked into two broad components. One is the effects of capital intensity, and the other is the effect of multi-factor productivity. This is a value-added or GDP-based multi-factor productivity. I think it was alluded to in the comments in the earlier session. It is different from the gross output or production-based MFP measure that Francisco presented earlier this morning. Mexico is not in this graph because we didn't have the figures to put you in, but we will do so. And still, what you can see here is that for a pretty large number of the OECD countries, what drives labor productivity is multi-factor productivity. So the part of this overall bar that is light blue is the share of value-added based multi-factor productivity that explains GDP per capita. And some countries apart, again, we're looking at Spain, Italy, where this was pretty weak. You do have important contributions of MFP that is based on a value-added measure to GDP per capita. Well, then the next question is, how does this value-added based MFP measure relate to the gross output-based MFP measures by industry that INEGI has been producing? All the information is there to make this link for Mexico, and actually at a very detailed level, more detailed level than for the average OECD country. And that brings me to a few comments on INEGI's work, where I'll try to make this link as well. Before I make this link, let me give you a few overall impressions. It was already said several times that this fully developed claims measure at the industry level is something that corresponds to the current state of the art in productivity measures. And it was also underlined several times that the integration with national accounts is an important feature in all this. Even though this may not be official data yet, it is a fact that it has been elaborated inside INEGI, and it has been elaborated in consistency with the national accounts. Those countries that do have this type of production of data tend to observe that when they construct their productivity data, that raises questions about the national accounts data. So there's kind of a feedback loop, because you suddenly have to interpret your national accounts data in a slightly different way. You have to make sure that your outputs and inputs are consistent by industry and overall. And so the elaboration of productivity measures is in a way a feedback loop that tends to increase the quality of national accounts data. It's kind of a positive side effect. Now, a few comments on the results. Of course, what strikes everyone, I think, who sees the results is the pervasiveness of the negative MFP growth that we see not only at the aggregate level, but also in many individual industries. Now, as I said before, this is not, it seems to be a bit of a story here, because we also saw that the overall labor productivity growth has been rather weak in Mexico, but there's no, one does not necessarily follow from the other, of course. Still, I think the widespread occurrence of negative MFP growth certainly requires that measurement issues are carefully considered and hypotheses explored whether any of the measurement can contribute to some of these results. Now, let me come to this link between the aggregate data and the industry level data that INEGI has been elaborating. And I'm sorry, I have to throw in a little equation here, but I think it will be very easy for you to follow. The first equation that you see here is simply expressed as a formula, the value-added based productivity growth that I showed in terms of bar graphs before. So basically we say that GDP per hour worked can be explained either by a change in capital intensity or by a change in value-added based multi-factor productivity. The thing is now that this measure of value-added based multi-factor productivity can be linked back to the industry level productivity growth rates measured on a gross output basis with a relatively simple formula, and that is the second line that you see there. There's a paper that Dale and I did only last year where we elaborate this and show how this can be derived, and I think all the data is there to do this. It's very easy for you to do. So I encourage you to do it because it will be very interesting, A, to compute the value-added based productivity figure, and B, link it back to your gross output based productivity measures that you have. There is because it's a weighted average of a particular nature, and I don't have to go into the details here. There is an effect there that you can identify in making this calculation. It's called reallocation effect here. And it basically portrays some of the things that André has been alluding to quickly. Namely, if you have a situation in an economy where, say, wages or returns to capital are very different across industries, then you have potentially a reallocation effect here, which means that by reallocating factors of production from one industry in another, you can increase your macroeconomic productivity. And this is what is captured by the reallocation effect that can have any sign. Okay, so you could have very well a situation where the individual MFP measures by industry are negative, but the reallocation effect is positive, so you get a different sign for the overall economic effect. So I think it's straightforward to do this calculation, and it links back nicely to the macroeconomic picture. So that is my first suggestion of work forward. My second suggestion is much more exploratory, but I bring it up here because it is work that we're just doing now at the OECD. So of course I'm very close to this. And it has to do with the scope of capital measures that we're using in our productivity calculations. It is standard practice, and this has also been put in place by INEGI, as in nearly all OECD countries, that when we compute our capital input, we base this on produced assets only. Okay, produced assets means machinery, equipment, structures, IT, but we do not normally include the capital services from natural assets. Okay, well, that means we're making some sort of implicit assumption that the natural capital services that go into the economy move at the same speed as the other capital services that are being produced. What are these non-produced capital services that are recognized by the system of national accounts? The three most important ones that I've listed here are mineral and energy resources. So if you pump oil out of the ground, that means that kind of nature gives you a capital service, and somehow they should be recognized. Land, the stuff that the buildings stand on, provide capital services, and typically we don't include those in our input measure for capital. Yet in countries with high degrees of urbanization, and I think Mexico City is a good example for this, but we have the same effect in Korea and Japan, recognition of the capital services of land can change the picture of your capital input measures quite significantly. Timber resources, I don't know how much this plays in Mexico, so I can't give you any figures for Mexico, but we did a few calculations for other countries, and I will present them to you now. So let me just repeat, this is not an omission or anything. I mean, the standard is to only look at the produced assets. But I think the assumption that the produced assets grow at the same rate as the non-produced assets, is more or less true depending on the country. Why? Well, how does this affect productivity measures? Well, if you have a situation where the growth rate of your natural capital, this extraction, for example, is larger or faster than the growth rate of other inputs, then it means if you construct a new set of inputs that includes these natural assets, you will get a different growth rate of inputs, and it means that your old inputs growth rate has been underestimated, and it means your productivity has been overestimated, and of course the other way around, depending on the relative growth of these natural inputs. Okay, I made exactly the same proposition and talk a year ago in a seminar in Canberra. Australia, of course, is a country that is hugely dependent on natural resources. And there was a big debate on the negative productivity developments in Canada, in Australia, in particular in the Australian mining industry, where you had a persistently negative growth rate of MFP in the Australian mining industry. And I said, well, try it out and include the flow of natural resources that the mining industry extracts in Australia and see what your capital input measure looks like. And a few weeks ago, the representative from the Australian Bureau of Statistics gave a presentation at the OECD where they did a study to check out what this meant. Well, for the mining industry in Australia, of course, the adjustment is important. What you have here is the evolution of capital services, including and excluding the subsoil assets that are being brought into the Australian economy. And if you include those, you have the red line, which means the evolution is rather constant. If you exclude them, you have the blue line, which is only produced capital, and indeed there has been a huge investment in machinery, equipment, and so on in the Australian mining industry. But it also means that you have a big rise of inputs, so that pulls down your residual productivity growth, of course. Well, you turn it over to the mining MFP in Australia, and here's what you get. Before you had the blue line, which showed negative MFP growth there, and including the subsoil resources, you're suddenly pretty stable. So well, this is at an industry level, and in a country that is highly dependent on subsoil resources. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily something that is true for Mexico as well, but it may be true for certain industries in Mexico. And in Australia, given that the mining sector is important, this even has macroeconomic effects, okay? Because the mining sector has a large share in the overall economy. So if you change productivity in the mining sector, well, that is even visible at the macro level. And the ABS calculated it for the business sector, and they changed the signs. You see, from -3%, the productivity growth switched to +4%, which is an important difference. But again, this is very specific because this is a large sector in Australia. We did so. We at the OECD tried to do some calculations for a larger number of countries. And as you would expect, those countries where natural resources play an important role come out first when it comes to the adjustment. So like Norway, here you get the difference between MFP growth measured with and without the oil extraction. It's interesting that the sign changes here, and actually over longer periods the adjustment is not that big. And there's a large number of countries where this plays no role. My own country, Austria, there is no natural resource worth reporting, so there's zero impact. And but for some countries it may play out. Chile, of course, is another country where you have an adjustment because copper production is really important there, and you somehow want to bring this in. All right, I don't want to overspend the time here. In conclusion, I think INEGI's release has been impressive, important, and really put you on the forefront of these developments internationally. I think the moment is now to analyze and use this data, and events like these are exactly what it needs to get feedback on these development. You join a number of leading national statistical offices that have been looking at this. Dale mentioned 9. I mean, here are a few of them cited here, who make a conscious effort of bringing in those calculations into their statistical work program. That is all a moment of self-promotion at the end. There's an OECD productivity compendium that will be released in a few weeks' time, which shows some of the things that I just showed you. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.